The morning I found Jessica's engagement ring sitting perfectly centered on our kitchen counter with no note. No explanation, just gonna knew something was wrong. But it wasn't what you'd think. See, Jessica never took off that ring. Ever. She wore it in the shower, to bed, even when she was kneading bread dough on Sunday mornings. The woman who cried when I proposed because she said she dreamed of this moment. Since she was 12 doesn't just vanish into thin air. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What really made my blood run cold wasn't the missing clothes from her closet or the empty space where her laptop used to sit. It was finding her sister Amy in our living room at 7 in the morning, still in yesterday's clothes, claiming she'd been there all night waiting for Jessica to come home. The same Amy who had a key to our place but had never used it without calling first. The same Amy who was sitting exactly where she could see both the front door and the kitchen counter where that ring was placed like some kind of monument. But here's the thing nobody knew. I'd been watching Amy watch us for months. 3 weeks earlier, everything seemed perfect. Jessica and I were planning our spring wedding, arguing over whether to serve salmon or chicken at the reception like it was the most important decision we'd ever make. We lived in this beautiful loft in downtown Portland, all exposed brick and floor-toozing windows that made the morning coffee taste better somehow. Jessica worked at a marketing firm downtown. I wrote code for a tech startup, and we had this comfortable routine that felt like real love. Amy was always around. Jessica's little sister, fresh out of college, working part-time at this hipster coffee shop in Hawthorne while finishing her psychology degree. She'd drop by for dinner, borrow Jessica's clothes, crash on our couch when she had late study sessions. Family was important to Jessica, and Amy being there felt natural. She was sweet, funny, always asking about my work and remembering little details about my day. I thought she was just being a good future sister-in-law. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed. How Amy always seemed to show up right after Jessica and I had an argument. How she'd ask casual questions about our relationship that seemed innocent but were actually fishing for information. How she'd volunteer to help with wedding planning but then subtly point out problems with our choices. Too expensive. Too traditional. Too rushed. The first time I really noticed something was off happened on a Thursday night in October. Jessica had to work late, some client emergency that had her stressed and snippy all week. I was making dinner when Amy knocked on the door, holding a bottle of wine and wearing this sad smile. "I thought you might need company," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Jess texted me about her work drama. You must be going crazy dealing with her mood." I wasn't going crazy. Jessica was stressed, sure, but we'd been together 2 years. I knew how to handle her work pressure. But Amy made it sound like I was some long-suffering victim of Jessica's professional ambitions. She opened the wine, poured herself a generous glass, and settled onto our couch like she lived there. "You're too good to her, Mike," she said, tucking her legs under herself. "Always so patient. I don't know how you do it." That comment stuck with me. Not because it was true, but because it was designed to make me think it was true. Amy had this way of making observations that sounded like compliments but felt like warnings. "You're too good to her. She doesn't appreciate you. You deserve better." Little seeds planted in casual conversation. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention. Really paying attention. Amy would show up whenever Jessica wasn't home. She'd ask about our fights before I'd even mentioned we'd had one. New details about our relationship that Jessica swore she'd never shared. When I brought this up to Jessica, she brushed it off. "Amy's perceptive," she'd say. "She cares about us. She wants to make sure we're happy." But I started testing it. I'd mentioned fake problems to Jessica when Amy was around. Just little things. Made up stress about work, imaginary concerns about our wedding venue. Within days, Amy would bring up those exact issues in private conversations with me, offering comfort and advice about problems that didn't exist. The breaking point came during Jessica's birthday party last month. We'd planned this nice dinner with friends at our favorite restaurant downtown. Amy arrived late, looking flustered and apologetic, explaining that she'd been stuck at the coffee shot because her coworker called in sick. Throughout dinner, she kept making these little comments about how hard Jessica worked, how stressed she looked, how I was such a saint for putting up with her intense schedule. But here's what Amy didn't. No, I knew. I'd stopped by Moonbeam Cafe that afternoon to grab Jessica's favorite lavender latte as a surprise. Amy wasn't there. The manager told me she'd left early, said she had somewhere important to be. When I asked Jessica about it later, she mentioned that Amy had been asking weird questions about our relationship all week, whether I ever got tired of Jessica's work focus, whether I ever wondered what it would be like to be with someone more easygoing. That's when I realized what was happening. Amy wasn't trying to help our relationship. She was trying to sabotage it. Every caring comment, every sympathetic observation, every helpful suggestion was designed to drive a wedge between Jessica and me. She wanted me to see Jessica as difficult, demanding, unappreciative. She wanted me to see her as the understanding alternative. The scary part was how good she was at it. If I hadn't been paying attention, if I hadn't started questioning her sudden appearances and convenient insights, I might have fallen for it. Amy had been studying psychology for 4 years. She knew exactly which buttons to push, exactly how to plant doubt without seeming manipulative. So when I found that engagement ring on the counter and Amy sitting in our living room with her story about waiting all night, I knew this wasn't a random disappearance. This was the next phase of whatever game Amy had been playing. Jessica was gone, and Amy was positioning herself as my primary source of comfort and support during the crisis. What Amy didn't realize was that I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. Every suspicious comment, every convenient coincidence, every perfectly timed appearance had taught me something about how her mind worked. She thought she was manipulating me, but I'd been learning to manipulate her right back. If Amy wanted to test my love for Jessica by making her disappear, then I'd test Amy's loyalty by seeing exactly how far she was willing to go. Because I had a feeling that Jessica wasn't really missing at all. She was hidden somewhere, probably, scared and confused, while her sister played out some twisted fantasy about stealing her life. The question was, how far would Amy go to make that fantasy real? And more importantly, how far would I go to stop her? Standing in our kitchen that morning, watching Amy fake concern while sitting next to evidence of her own crime, I realized this wasn't just about saving Jessica anymore. This was about exposing someone who'd been lying to our faces for months. Someone who'd taken our trust and twisted it into a weapon against us. Game on, Amy. Let's see who's really better at playing psychological chess. The first 48 hours after Jessica's disappearance were a masterclass in Amy's manipulation. She moved into her loft temporarily to help coordinate the search efforts, bringing an overnight bag that looked suspiciously well-packed for someone who claimed to be in crisis. She made coffee in our kitchen like she'd been doing it for years, organized search parties with the efficiency of a military commander, and fielded phone calls from Jessica's worried friends with just the right mixture of hope and despair. But I knew Jessica better than anyone, and something about this whole scenario felt choreographed. Jessica was spontaneous about small things, but methodical about big ones. She planned our weekend hikes down to the last granola bar. She had backup plans for her backup plans at work. The idea that she'd just vanish without a trace, leaving behind her phone, her wallet, and her car. Didn't match the woman who kept emergency contact cards in 3 different pockets. Amy, on the other hand, seemed to know exactly what to do at every moment. When the police arrived to take the missing person report, she had Jessica's dental records ready. When Jessica's boss called asking about missed meetings, Amy had a prepared statement about family emergency leave. When our friend David offered to organize search teams, Amy already had a list of locations where Jessica might have gone to clear her head. Detective Sarah Martinez was thorough, but not particularly optimistic. Portland saw dozens of missing person cases every month, and most adults who disappeared voluntarily stayed that way until they were ready to come home. She took photos of the engagement ring, asked standard questions about recent arguments or unusual behavior, and promised to file the report immediately. But I could see in her eyes that she figured Jessica had gotten cold feet about the wedding and bolted. What really convinced me this was Amy's show was the timeline she presented to the police. According to Amy, Jessica had been acting strange. For weeks, distant, moody, talking about feeling trapped and overwhelmed. Amy claimed she'd been worried about Jessica's mental state but hadn't wanted to interfere in our relationship. She painted a picture of a woman on the edge of a breakdown, someone who might run away to escape the pressure of adult responsibilities. The problem was, I'd been living with Jessica every day for those same weeks, and none of that was true. Jessica had been excited about the wedding, maybe a little stressed about work, but nothing close to the emotional crisis Amy described. Yet Amy told these lies with such conviction, such detailed concern, that even I almost started questioning my own observations. During the second night of Amy's stay, she knocked on my bedroom door around midnight. I was lying awake staring at the ceiling, genuinely worried despite my suspicions. When I heard her soft voice calling my name, she was wearing one of Jessica's oversized t-shirts, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking vulnerable and scared. "I can't sleep," she whispered. "Every time I close my eyes, I imagine something terrible happening to her. Can we just talk for a while?" She curled up in the armchair next to my bed, pulling her knees to her chest like a child seeking comfort. For the next 2 hours, she told me stories about growing up with Jessica, how protective Jessica had always been, how guilty Amy felt for not preventing whatever breakdown had led to this disappearance. She painted herself as the devoted little sister who'd always lived in Jessica's shadow, but loved her unconditionally anyway. "Jessica talks about you constantly," Amy said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She's so lucky to have someone who loves her the way you do. I just hope she realizes that before it's too late." The conversation felt intimate, bonding, like we were two people brought together by shared loss and genuine concern. Amy was good at this, creating emotional connection through manufactured vulnerability. She knew exactly how to make herself seem trustworthy and sympathetic, while subtly reinforcing the narrative that Jessica was unstable and unpredictable. But I'd learned to watch for her tells over the past months. Amy touched her collarbone. When she lied, a nervous habit she probably didn't realize she had. She'd done it when explaining her late arrival at Jessica's birthday party, and claiming she'd been at the coffee shop during times I knew she wasn't. She was doing it now while describing Jessica's supposed emotional crisis. The next morning, Amy suggested we check Jessica's laptop for clues about her state of mind. She seemed surprised when I told her Jessica had taken it with her, then quickly recovered and suggested we look through Jessica's desk instead. As we went through drawers and files together, Amy found things I'd somehow missed during my own searches. A printed email about postponing wedding venue payments, a handwritten note that said "can't do this anymore" in Jessica's handwriting, a business card for a women's crisis counselor with Jessica's phone number written on the back. Each piece of evidence perfectly supported Amy's theory about Jessica's mental breakdown. Too perfectly. The email was dated 3 days ago, but I distinctly remembered Jessica confirming final head counts with the caterer just last week. The handwritten note was on paper from a notepad I'd never seen before. The counselor's business card looked freshly printed, not something that had been sitting in a drawer for weeks. "I should have seen the signs," Amy said, holding the note with trembling hands. She was crying for help, and I was too wrapped up in my own problems to notice. That afternoon, Amy organized the first official search party. 20 of Jessica's friends and co-workers met at Riverside Park, where Jessica supposedly liked to jog when she was stressed. Amy had printed flyers with Jessica's photo and distributed them with the efficiency of a campaign manager. She gave a brief speech about Jessica's state of mind, her pattern of seeking solitude during difficult times, and the importance of checking hiking trails and quiet spots where she might be hiding. I watched Amy coordinate this performance and felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. This wasn't a search party. This was theater designed to establish a public record of Jessica's instability and Amy's devoted concern. Every person who participated would remember Amy as the loving sister who tried desperately to find her troubled sibling. When Jessica's body was eventually discovered, or when she was declared legally dead after the statutory waiting period, Amy would be the grieving relative who'd done everything possible to save her. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't where Jessica was, or whether she was safe. The question was what Amy's endgame looked like. Did she plan to kill Jessica and claim it was suicide? Was Jessica being held somewhere against her will? Or was this elaborate psychological torture designed to break Jessica? down until she actually did have a breakdown and disappear for real. I needed to find Jessica before Amy's timeline reached its conclusion. But I also needed to be careful. Amy was smart, methodical, and clearly willing to go to extreme lengths to get what she wanted. If I confronted her directly without proof, she'd simply adjust her strategy and become more dangerous. If I went to the police with suspicions but no evidence, Amy would use their dismissal to further establish her credibility. So I decided to play Amy's game by her own rules. If she wanted to manipulate and deceive, I'd manipulate and deceive right back. If she thought she could use psychology against me, I'd show her what happened when someone who actually understood her methods fought back. The next morning, I started my own investigation. Not into Jessica's disappearance, but into Amy's life, her patterns, her secrets. Because everyone who's willing to destroy other people's lives has something in their own life they're desperate to protect. I just had to find out what Amy was hiding, and then I'd have the leverage I needed to bring Jessica home and expose Amy for what she really was. Time to see how well Amy handled being the one under surveillance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Amy's psychology textbooks were scattered across her apartment like breadcrumbs, leading to the truth. I'd offered to help her grab some clothes and study materials, playing the supportive future brother-in-law while she continued her performance as the devoted sister. What I found in her studio apartment near Portland State revealed months of preparation that made my skin crawl. The books weren't just assigned reading, they were heavily annotated field guides to human manipulation. Sections on gaslighting were highlighted in yellow. Pages about emotional dependency were bookmarked with sticky notes. And entire chapters on trauma bonding had been photocopied and pinned to her bulletin board. In the margins, she'd written notes that read like a predator's playbook. Make target question, own perceptions. Create artificial crises to establish yourself as support system. Isolation increases emotional reliance. Hidden beneath her mattress, I found a journal that documented everything. Every conversation we'd had, every reaction I'd shown, every weakness she thought she'd identified. The entries read like a scientist studying lab rats, clinical and cold in their assessment of my psychology. She'd been tracking my moods, my arguments with Jessica, even my work stress levels, looking for optimal moments to insert herself into my emotional landscape. But the most chilling discovery was a detailed timeline she'd created for what she called Project Replacement. The plan stretched back 6 months, beginning with subtle undermining of my confidence in Jessica and progressing through carefully orchestrated emotional manipulation designed to make me see Amy as the better choice. The final phase, scheduled to begin exactly when it did, involved Jessica's temporary removal from the picture to allow for complete emotional transfer. Amy had calculated everything down to the smallest detail. She knew that 3 weeks of Jessica being missing would be enough time to establish deep emotional dependency, but not long enough for police investigation to become seriously invasive. She'd researched the legal timeline for declaring someone dead, the psychological impact of sudden loss, and the statistical likelihood of relationships surviving traumatic disappearances. This wasn't impulsive jealousy. This was premeditated psychological warfare. Her laptop revealed even more disturbing evidence. She'd been researching rental cabins in remote areas outside Portland, paying special attention to properties with limited cell service and no nearby neighbors. Credit card statements showed payments to places she'd never mentioned visiting, including a storage unit facility across town that she'd been renting for 3 months. Most damning of all, her browser history showed extensive research into sedatives that could be obtained without prescription and their effects on memory formation. The storage unit visit required more careful planning. Amy had become suspicious of my supportive behavior, occasionally catching me in small inconsistencies when I pretended to believe her narrative about Jessica's mental state. I needed to access that unit without her knowledge, which meant waiting for the right opportunity when she'd be occupied for several hours. That opportunity came when Amy volunteered to organize another search party. time focusing on the hiking trails east of the city where Jessica supposedly went to think through major life decisions. While Amy gathered volunteers and distributed flyers. I drove across town to the storage facility with a story prepared about retrieving some of Jessica's belongings at Amy's request. The facility manager was sympathetic and surprisingly willing to bend the rules for someone dealing with a family emergency. Armed with Amy's unit number and a fake story about needing Jessica's medical records for the police investigation, gained access to a 10 by 10 space that contained the infrastructure of Amy's entire operation. 3 burner phones were charging. On a folding table, their call logs showing communications with numbers I didn't recognize. A camping setup suggested someone had been living in rough conditions recently. Maps of the Oregon coast were marked with locations circled in red ink, connected by routes that avoided major highways and populated areas. Most unsettling of all, boxes of women's clothing in Jessica's size suggested Amy had been planning this scenario for months, preparing for the day when she'd need to keep someone hidden and comfortable enough to stay alive, but isolated enough to remain controlled. But the real revelation came in a manila folder labeled contingencies. Amy had prepared for multiple scenarios depending on how I responded to Jessica's disappearance. If I seemed to be moving on too quickly, she had plans to produce evidence of Jessica's death to lock in my grief and dependency. If I became suspicious of the disappearance circumstances, she had strategies for redirecting my attention toward other theories, including an elaborate setup that would make it appear Jessica had been having an affair. Most chilling was her backup plan if I proved completely resistant to manipulation. She'd researched my work schedule, my regular routines, potential accident scenarios that could eliminate me from the equation entirely while making it appear unrelated to Jessica's disappearance. Amy wasn't just trying to steal my fiancé's life. She was prepared to destroy anyone who threatened her fantasy of replacing Jessica completely. I photographed everything with my phone, documenting the evidence carefully while listening for any sounds that might indicate Amy's early return. The journal entries, the research materials, the camping equipment, the contingency plans, all of it painted a picture of someone who'd crossed the line from unhealthy obsession into dangerous predatory behavior. But I still didn't know where. Jessica was being held, and I was running out of time to find her before Amy escalated to whatever final phase she had planned. The maps suggested coastal locations, but Oregon had hundreds of miles of remote coastline with countless isolated cabins and camping areas. I needed to force Amy to reveal Jessica's location without letting her know I'd discovered the truth about her operation. That evening, Amy returned from the search party with news that several hikers had reported seeing a woman matching Jessica's description near the Columbia River Gorge 3 days earlier. She'd spoken with these witnesses personally, she claimed, and was convinced Jessica was hiding somewhere in the wilderness east of the city, probably struggling with exposure and dehydration by now. "We need to expand the search," Amy said, spreading maps across our kitchen table with the urgency of someone genuinely concerned for a missing loved one. "If she's been out there for over a week without proper supplies, she's probably hurt and scared. We might not have much time left." I nodded along with her performance while studying her body language for tells. She was excited, almost energized, which suggested this was another manufactured development designed to move her timeline forward. The Columbia River Gorge story would justify expanding search efforts while drawing attention away from the coastal areas where I suspected Jessica was actually being held. "You're right," I said, leaning over the maps she'd laid out. "We should organize teams to cover these areas systematically." "But Amy, I've been thinking about something. What if Jessica doesn't want to be found right now? What if she's dealing with something we don't understand and our search efforts are actually making things worse for her?" Amy's eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of doubt she'd been trying to cultivate, the suggestion that maybe Jessica's disappearance was voluntary, and that pushing too hard to find her might be disrespectful of her choices. She moved closer to me, her hand landing gently on my shoulder in a gesture that felt possessive rather than comforting. "I've been wondering the same thing," she said softly. "Maybe we need to step back and let her come to us when she's ready. Sometimes the best way to help someone is to give them space to figure things out on their own." It was perfectly calculated psychology. It's make me feel like the idea of giving up the search was my own conclusion rather than her suggestion. Make me feel wise and considerate for respecting Jessica's supposed need for space. And most importantly, make me feel grateful for Amy's understanding and support during this difficult decision. But I could see through her strategy now, and I was ready to turn her own methods against her. If Amy wanted to play psychological chess, I'd show her what happened when she faced an opponent who understood her tactics and wasn't afraid to use them. Time to find out exactly where Amy was hiding Jessica and what she planned to do with her when the game reached its final stage. The coastal cabin rental websites became my obsession over the next 2 days, while Amy continued her performance as the concerned sister. I cross-referenced her credit card transactions with property listings, looking for isolated locations that matched her research pattern. When I finally found it, the pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. Whispering Pines Lodge was a remote rental property 40 miles south of Lincoln City, accessible only by a winding gravel road that dead-ended at the ocean cliffs. The listing boasted complete privacy, no cell service, and amenities perfect for digital detox retreats. Amy had booked it for a full month under a fake name, paying cash through a third-party booking service that specialized in anonymous reservations. But I couldn't just drive out there and confront whatever situation Amy had created. She was smart enough to have contingency plans, and showing up unannounced might trigger something that would put Jessica in more danger. I needed to force Amy to take me there willingly, which meant making her believe it was her idea. My opportunity came when Amy announced she'd received a call from someone claiming to have seen Jessica at a coastal rest stop 2 days earlier. The witness described a disoriented woman who seemed confused and frightened, asking for directions to Portland, but unable to remember how she'd gotten there. Amy presented this information with perfect emotional calibration, mixing hope with concern while suggesting Jessica might be suffering from some kind of psychological break that was affecting her memory and judgment. "I think we should drive out there and look for her," Amy said, spreading coastal maps across our coffee table. "If she's wandering around confused, she could be in real danger. The weather's been rough, and those cliffs are treacherous even." In good conditions, I pretended to consider this carefully, weighing the pros and cons while Amy watched my face for signs of agreement. She was pushing me toward this decision while making it seem like my choice, a manipulation technique I'd observed her use dozens of times over the past months. "You're right," I said finally. "We can't just sit here hoping she finds her way home. If Jessica's out there alone and confused, every hour matters." Amy's relief was genuine, though not for the reasons she pretended she'd been looking for. A way to move to the next phase of her plan, and my agreement gave her the perfect opportunity. We packed supplies for what she claimed would be a comprehensive search of the coastal area. But I noticed she seemed unusually familiar with the specific routes and locations we'd need to check. The drive took us through increasingly isolated territory as we left the main highway and followed winding roads through dense forest. Amy navigated without consulting maps, taking turns with confidence that suggested she'd made this journey multiple times recently. She kept up a steady stream of conversation about Jessica's childhood, their shared memories of family camping trips, and her hopes that we'd find Jessica safe and ready to come home. But I could see the excitement in her eyes, the anticipation of someone about to reveal a carefully orchestrated surprise. She thought she was bringing me to the climactic moment of her psychological manipulation. The scene where I discovered Jessica in whatever compromised state Amy had engineered and turned to Amy for comfort and support. When we reached Whispering Pines Lodge, the isolation was even more complete than I'd imagined. The cabin sat on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, surrounded by dense forest with no visible neighbors in any direction. The gravel road we'd taken was the only way in or out, and I could see why Amy had chosen this location for whatever she had planned. "This is where the witness said they saw her," Amy explained. Though I hadn't seen her consult any notes about witness statements, she apparently asked for directions to a cabin in this area, but the description she gave was confused and contradictory. Amy produced a key to the cabin with practiced ease, claiming she'd spoken with the rental agency about checking the property for signs of Jessica's presence. As we approached the front door, I could hear sounds from inside. It's muffled movement, possibly a television playing, definitely evidence that someone was occupying the space. "Jessica," Amy called out, her voice perfectly modulated to sound hopeful. "And concerned?" "Jess, are you in there?" "It's Amy. Mike's with me. We've been so worried about you." The sounds from inside stopped abruptly, replaced by silence that felt heavy and tense. Amy used the key to open the door, and we stepped into a living room that looked like it had been set up for long-term occupancy. Blankets were arranged on the couch. Books and magazines were scattered on the coffee table. And the kitchen showed signs of recent meal preparation. "Jessica," Amy called again, moving deeper into the cabin with me following close behind. "We're here to help. Whatever you're going through, we can work it out together." We found Jessica in the bedroom, and the sight of her made my heart break, and my anger flare simultaneously. She was sitting on the bed, obviously drugged, her eyes unfocused, and her movements sluggish. She looked up at us with confusion rather than recognition, as though she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. "Mike?" she said softly, her voice thick and uncertain. "I don't understand," Amy said. "You didn't want to see me anymore." "She said you were angry about the wedding and needed space to think." Amy immediately moved to Jessica's side, her demeanor shifting into caregiver mode with professional smoothness. "Jess, you're confused again. Remember, we talked about this. You came here because you were having panic attacks about the wedding. You asked me not to tell Mike where you were because you didn't want him to see you like this." Jessica's face crumpled with distress and confusion. "I don't remember that. I remember being in our kitchen, and then Amy brought me tea, and then everything gets blurry. I keep trying to call you, but my phone doesn't work here." Pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Amy had drugged Jessica, transported her to this isolated location, and spent the past 2 weeks systematically breaking down her sense of reality, while feeding her lies about my reaction to her disappearance. This wasn't just kidnapping. It was deliberate psychological torture designed to make Jessica doubt her own memories and perceptions. "Amy," I said carefully, not wanting to escalate the situation while Jessica was in such a vulnerable state, "I think we need to get Jessica to a doctor. She seems disoriented and confused." This level of memory loss could indicate a serious medical problem. Amy's expression flickered for just a moment, a flash of calculation before she resumed her concerned sister performance. "I've been monitoring her condition carefully. She's been having episodes like this for weeks, even before she came here. I think the stress of the wedding preparations triggered some kind of breakdown." But Jessica was looking at me with growing clarity, as though my presence was helping her focus through whatever chemical haze Amy had been maintaining. "Mike, I don't remember deciding to come here. I remember asking Amy not to tell you where I was." "Something's wrong. Nothing Amy's been telling me makes sense." That's when Amy realized her careful psychological manipulation was falling apart. The drug regimen that had kept Jessica compliant and confused wasn't strong enough to overcome the cognitive clarity that came from seeing me again. Her elaborate fiction about Jessica's voluntary retreat was crumbling in real time as Jessica's actual memories began reasserting themselves. Amy reached into her purse with movements that were too quick and too purposeful for casual searching. When her hand emerged holding a small pistol, I realized we'd reached the point where Amy's psychological manipulation gave way to direct physical threat. "Nobody's going anywhere," Amy said, her voice dropping its artificial warmth and revealing the cold calculation that had been underneath all along. "We're going to sit down and work through this situation calmly and rationally." The caring sister mask had finally slipped completely, and I was looking at someone who'd been planning this confrontation for months. Amy had never intended for her manipulation to remain subtle indefinitely. She'd been building toward this. The moment when she'd have complete control over both Jessica and me, isolated and helpless, in a location where no one would think to look for us. But Amy had made one critical miscalculation in her elaborate psychological warfare. She'd spent so much time studying my emotional reactions and manipulating my perceptions that she'd overlooked a fundamental truth about who I was and what I was capable of when the people I loved were threatened. "Game over, Amy. Time to see what happens when your victim fights back." The gun in Amy's hand looked small and almost delicate, but her grip was steady, and her eyes had gone completely cold. This was the real Amy, the predator who'd been hiding behind months of calculated sympathy and manufactured concern. Jessica made a soft sound of confusion and fear, still too drugged to fully process what was happening, but aware enough to recognize the danger. "Amy, put the gun down," I said, keeping my voice calm while my mind raced through options. "Whatever you think this is going to accomplish, it's not going to work. People know we came out here looking for Jessica. When we don't come back, they'll send search teams." Amy laughed, a sound completely devoid of the warmth she'd been performing for weeks. "Actually, they won't. I sent texts from your phone an hour ago telling your friend David that we'd decided to give Jessica space and stop actively searching. I used Jessica's phone to send similar messages to her work and her friends, explaining that she needed time to work through her personal issues without pressure. She'd thought of everything, covering every angle to buy herself the time she needed to complete whatever final phase she had planned. But I could see something she'd missed in her careful calculations. The drugs she'd been using to keep Jessica compliant were wearing off faster than Amy had expected, and Jessica was becoming more alert and aware with each passing minute. "What do you want, Amy?" I asked, shifting slightly to position myself. "Between her and Jessica, you've gone to incredible lengths to orchestrate this situation. There has to be an endgame." "I want what should have been mine from the beginning," Amy said, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. "Yes. Jessica has always gotten everything handed to her. The good grades, the successful career, the perfect boyfriend who worships her. She never had to work for any of it. Never had to struggle or fight or prove she deserved it." Amy's grip on the gun shifted, and I could see her finger resting on the trigger with dangerous casualness. "But I studied you, Mike. I learned everything. About what you needed, what you wanted, what would make you happy. It could have been so much better for you than she ever was. I would have appreciated you, supported you, never taken you for granted the way she does." The delusion in her voice was complete and terrifying. Amy genuinely believed she deserved my love more than Jessica did, that her months of manipulation and psychological torture were somehow proof of her superior devotion. She'd constructed an entire fantasy where she was the victim and Jessica was the obstacle preventing her from claiming what was rightfully hers. "So what's the plan now?" I asked, taking another small step forward. "You shoot us both and claim it was a murder-suicide? You kill me and keep Jessica prisoner until she develops Stockholm Syndrome? How exactly does this end with you getting what you want?" Amy's expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time since she'd revealed the gun. I could see her running through scenarios, weighing options, trying to find a path forward that didn't involve her becoming a murderer. But she'd already crossed so many lines that the distance to the next one seemed negligible. "Jessica's going to have an accident," Amy said finally. "She's been mentally unstable for weeks, confused and disoriented from her breakdown. She's going to walk out onto those cliffs tonight and fall to her death while trying to get better. Cell phone reception to call for help." The casual way she described Jessica's planned murder made my blood run cold, but it also revealed the weakness in her plan. Amy was still thinking like a manipulator rather than a killer. She needed the death to look accidental, which meant she needed Jessica to be mobile and coherent enough to walk to the cliff edge voluntarily. "And what happens to me in this scenario?" I asked, continuing to edge closer while keeping my voice conversational. "You'll be devastated, of course. Guilt-ridden about not finding her sooner, traumatized by losing the woman you loved in such a tragic way. But I'll be there to help you through the grieving process. I'll be the only person who truly understands what you're going through because I lost her too." Amy's fantasy was so detailed, so rehearsed, that she'd obviously been planning this exact conversation for weeks. She could see herself comforting me through Jessica's funeral, supporting me through the legal proceedings, gradually becoming the most important person in my devastated life, until I finally realized I loved her too. "There's just one problem with your plan, Amy," I said, taking advantage of her momentary distraction as she described her post-murder seduction strategy. "You made the same mistake Jessica's been making our entire relationship." Amy's eyes narrowed with confusion. "What mistake? You both underestimated me?" I lunged forward before she could process what I meant, grabbing her wrist and forcing the gun toward the ceiling. The weapon discharged with a deafening crack, but the bullet buried itself harmlessly in the wooden beams above us. Amy was stronger than I'd expected, struggling viciously to regain control of the gun while screaming curses that revealed years of buried resentment and rage. Behind us, Jessica had managed to get off the bed and was moving toward the door with unsteady steps. Whatever drugs Amy had been giving her were wearing off rapidly. It's probably because Amy had reduced the dosage in preparation for the planned accident that would require Jessica to be mobile. Amy and I crashed into the coffee table, scattering books and magazines while grappling for control of the weapon. She was fighting with the desperate strength of someone whose entire fantasy future was crumbling around her. But I had advantages she hadn't calculated. I was bigger, stronger, and fighting to protect someone I loved rather than to possess them. The gun went off again as we struggled, this time shattering a window and letting in the sound of crashing waves from the cliffs below. Amy tried to bite my hand, scratch at my eyes, use any method of violence that might give her an advantage. But she'd spent so much time thinking like a psychologist that she'd forgotten to prepare for actual physical confrontation. Managed to wrench the gun away from her and immediately put distance between us, breathing hard while keeping the weapon pointed safely toward the floor. Amy collapsed against the wall, her perfect manipulation finally revealed as the desperate delusion it had always been. "Jessica, can you call 911?" I asked, though I knew the answer before she shook her head. "No signal," she confirmed, her voice getting stronger as the drugs continued to clear her system. Amy looked up at us with an expression of pure hatred, all pretense finally abandoned. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed for you, what I've given up to make this work. Loved you more than she ever could." "No, Amy," I said, helping Jessica toward the door while keeping the gun trained on her sister. "You never loved me at all. You loved the idea of taking something that belonged to Jessica. There's a difference." We left Amy sitting in the wreckage of her elaborate manipulation, drove her car back toward civilization, and eventually found cell service to call the police. Detective Martinez met us at the hospital, where Jessica was being evaluated for drug exposure and psychological trauma. Amy was arrested at the cabin 6 hours later, still sitting exactly where we'd left her, surrounded by the evidence of her months-long conspiracy. The journal, the research materials, the rental agreements, and her own detailed confessions provided more than enough proof for the district attorney to file charges for kidnapping, false imprisonment, assault with a deadly weapon, and attempted murder. 3 months later, Jessica and I were married in a small ceremony with only our closest friends present. We'd postponed the big wedding we'd originally planned, deciding we needed something simple and genuine after surviving Amy's elaborate deception. Jessica wore a different engagement ring, one we'd chosen together to replace the one that had sat on our kitchen counter like a monument to manipulation. Amy was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8. If she completed extensive psychological treatment, Jessica and I moved to Seattle. It's far enough from Portland to feel like a fresh start, but close enough to maintain the friendships that had survived. Amy's attempts to isolate us from our support system. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never noticed Amy's manipulation tactics, if I'd been a more trusting person or a less observant one. But then I look at Jessica, healthy and happy and free from her sister's psychological torture, and I realize that some fights are worth whatever it takes to win them. Love isn't about possession or control or proving you deserve someone more than someone else does. Real love is about seeing someone clearly, accepting them completely, and protecting them fiercely when they can't protect themselves. Amy never understood that distinction, and that's exactly why she lost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.